The women's backs ached, their hands raw, but there was a rhythm now, a strange peace in repetition. A cowboy passed by, wiping sweat from his brow. He paused beside Aiko and tipped his hat. "Good work," he said simply before walking on. She didn't understand the words, but she knew the meaning. She stood a little straighter. Around her, the others did too. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of the day, the women staggered back toward the barracks, legs trembling, hearts thudding. They had expected torment and found exhaustion instead. The difference was dizzying. Behind them, the cowboys gathered their tools, their laughter rising again in the warm air. For the first time, the women did not hear it as mockery. It sounded like something else entirely. Normal life unbroken by war. As Aiko washed her hands in the tin basin outside the barracks, the sun dipped low, staining the sky red. She glanced at the horizon where the cowboys were still moving among the corrals, silhouetted against the light. Somewhere deep inside her, something shifted. This was not mercy, not pity. It was respect, the kind earned through shared sweat, and as the smell of supper drifted from the mess hall, she realized that what she feared most now was not cruelty but kindness. The bell clanged through the fatting light, sharp and metallic, cutting through the hum of crickets and lowing cattle. The Japanese women froze mid-step, uncertain whether the sound meant assembly or punishment. But then they saw the cowboys putting away tools, washing their hands at the trough, wiping their brows with their sleeves. The men moved toward the long wooden tables set outside the mess hall where steam rose from metal pots and the scent of beef stew hung thick in the evening air. The women's stomachs clenched at once, an involuntary ache that made their knees weak. They had been living for weeks on rationed bread, thin soup, and fear. Hunger was an old enemy, one that dulled pride. Yet tonight, pride refused to bow easily. Aiko stood among the women, her face streaked with dust, her hair clinging to her neck. Her body begged for food, but her mind whispered warnings. To accept kindness from the enemy was to betray everything she'd been taught. Behind her, someone muttered a prayer in Japanese. Another turned away, ashamed of her own hunger. The cowboys noticed their hesitation. Walt, the same man who had offered her water that morning, looked at the group for a long moment, then stepped forward. He removed his hat, held it at his side, and said something in English, slow and steady. None of the women understood all the words, but the meaning came through when he pointed toward the tables and gestured for them to move ahead. "You work same as us," he said, the faintest smile on his face. "You eat first." No one moved. The women looked at one another as though waiting for the hidden cruelty to reveal itself. Surely this was a trick, a test of obedience, a prelude to mockery. One woman, older than the rest, shook her head sharply, refusing to step forward. But Aiko felt something else rising within her, something that wasn't defiance but disbelief wrapped in exhaustion. Slowly, as if walking into a dream, she took a single step. The gravel crunched beneath her boots. The cowboys did not stop her. Then another woman followed, and another, until all of them were moving toward the tables. The sight was almost surreal, prisoners being invited to sit first while their guards stood waiting behind them. The women lowered themselves onto the benches, stiff-backed, hands in their laps. The aroma of stew was overpowering. Meat, onions, pepper, and the faint sweetness of corn. It was a smell that spoke of homes they'd lost, of warmth they no longer believed they deserved. When the first bowl was passed down the line, the women hesitated again. Aiko's hand trembled as she lifted her spoon. The stew was thick, heavy, and impossibly rich. She brought it to her lips and paused, her throat tightening around her. The others did the same, each tasting with disbelief that bordered on fear. Then slowly the silence broke, not with words but with the sound of spoons scraping against metal bowls. Hunger triumphed over pride. For the first time since capture, they ate not as prisoners but as human beings. Walt and the others stood back, leaning on posts or sitting cross-legged in the dirt, waiting until every woman had eaten before taking their share. The gesture was quiet, unspoken, but it hit the women harder than any kindness could. It was dignity, a gift so rare in war it felt almost unbearable. As the sun slipped below the horizon, lanterns were lit along the tables. The light flickered across faces, still weary, still searching for malice. But none came. A cowboy nearby, barely older than the women themselves, laughed softly when one of them accidentally slurped too loudly. The sound startled her, and for a heartbeat she nearly dropped her spoon. Then she realized he was laughing with her, not at her. Something inside cracked open, fragile as porcelain. She laughed back shyly, and the others followed, the sound small but real. For a few minutes the camp felt less like a prison and more like a forgotten corner of peace. The cowboys talked quietly among themselves, their voices low and warm. The women ate until the ache in their bellies softened into calm. In that strange twilight, the war seemed to pause, held back by something as simple as shared food. When the meal ended, Walt stood again and tipped his hat, a gesture now familiar but still bewildering. "Tomorrow's another day," he said, and his tone carried neither command nor threat, just weary respect. The women rose slowly, their legs heavy, and began to drift back toward the barracks. Aiko looked over her shoulder once, watching the cowboys sit down to eat their share only after the women had left. She couldn't explain why it mattered so much, but she knew it did. In the darkness under a sky spangled with stars, she whispered to no one, "The enemy waits until we are fed." And though her words were quiet, the truth of them would echo for years to come. The days began to blend into one another, each marked by the same rising sun, the same creak of barn doors, the same steady rhythm of boots on dirt. The women awoke before dawn now, not because they were ordered to, but because it felt right. The cold air bit their skin as they washed in tin basins, and the sky above them stretched endlessly, pale and merciless. Yet somewhere between exhaustion and routine, they began to find a strange kind of peace. The work that had once felt like punishment had become a language, a way to measure their worth without fear of humiliation. Walt and the other cowboys never shouted, never raised their voices, yet the rules were clear and absolute. You worked hard, you showed respect, and you kept your word. That was the code of the plains, and it needed no translation. At first, the women tried to resist the rhythm of that life. Pride had been drilled into them as armor, obedience as survival. But the ranch demanded something different. It asked for effort, not submission. When they faltered, there were no beatings, no jeers, only the quiet expectation that they would stand back up. Aiko learned this one morning when a sack tore open in her hands, spilling feed across the ground. She fell to her knees instinctively, muttering apologies, bracing for anger. Instead, Walt knelt beside her and began scooping the feed back into the sack wordlessly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. When she looked up, confused, he simply nodded once and said, "Ask everybody." It was the first lesson she learned about these men. Respect was not something they took by force. It was something they offered freely and expected to be returned in kind. The women began to mirror the cowboys in small, almost invisible ways. They learned to tie ropes with calloused fingers, to mend broken fences with quiet determination. When one fell behind, another stepped in without being asked. It was not kindness, it was code. Each day's labor became a silent promise to one another that they would not yield to weakness, not because they were prisoners but because they were workers now. There was dignity in sweat. There was strength in endurance. The cowboys' philosophy seeped into them slowly like water into dry earth. It was a creed built on action, not words. A man's word was his bond. His honesty was his armor. "You lie once," Walt told them one evening, speaking to no one in particular, "and it'll hang around your neck forever." The women didn't understand the words, but they understood the weight in his voice. Later, when a small tool went missing, one of the women, young, terrified, admitted she had borrowed it and forgotten to return it. Walt didn't punish her. He only looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "You told the truth, that's what matters." The next day she worked harder than anyone else in the camp. There were no written laws on the ranch, no guards patrolling with rifles, no ranks or medals, yet order held. When a woman bowed to thank a cowboy for handing her a tool, he tipped his hat in return, a gesture she soon came to recognize as equal in weight. Bows met with nods, silence met with patience. Even laughter had its own language. One afternoon, when a sudden gust of wind blew hay into everyone's faces, the entire group, cowboys and captives alike, burst into laughter. It was wild and unguarded, carried away by the wind across the endless plains. The women started to realize that the cowboys' world was bound not by fences but by honor. It was a land where a man's strength came from restraint, where authority was not shouted but shown. The simplicity of it unsettled them at first. They had grown up under commands, their loyalty measured by obedience. Yet here loyalty was measured by trust, and trust was something earned in the quiet moments, when someone shared water without asking, when a back was turned without fear. At night, as the wind howled across the open fields, Aiko would sit outside the barracks, watching the faint glow of lanterns from the bunkhouse. She thought of home, of the rigid order that had shaped her life, of the lessons about honor that had led her into war. And she thought of these men, rough, unrefined, smelling of tobacco and leather, who somehow embodied that same honor more purely than anyone she had ever known. For the first time she began to understand that dignity did not require cruelty, authority did not need to be feared. In the stillness of the prairie night beneath the vast American sky, the truth settled over her like dust. The code of the plains was not written on paper or shouted through ranks. It was carried in the heart, and it could not be broken. When the order came that they could finally write home, the women gathered in the mess hall as if summoned to judgment. A wooden crate filled with paper, pencils, and envelopes sat on the table. The room was silent except for the creak of chairs and the ticking of an old clock on the wall. For the first time in months, they were allowed to address their families, their superiors, their homeland. Yet the gift felt heavy, almost cruel. Each woman stared at the blank sheet before her, paralyzed by the question that hovered like a shadow over every line. What could they possibly say? Aiko held her pencil but didn't write. Her fingers trembled as she thought of her mother in Nagasaki, her father who had served in the Navy, her brothers still somewhere on the battlefield. They had all been taught the same creed, that capture was worse than death, that to live under the mercy of an enemy was dishonor beyond redemption. And yet here she was alive because of that enemy's kindness. They had fed her, clothed her, even shown her respect. Gratitude welled in her chest like a forbidden emotion, shameful and tender. If she wrote the truth, her family would never forgive her. If she lied, she would betray what she now knew to be real. Around her, the other women wrestled with the same torment. Some bent their heads low, writing quickly as if afraid the paper might accuse them. Others stared into space, their pencils unmoving. One woman, Yumi, whispered to no one in particular, "How do you write about kindness when you were raised to hate it?" The question hung in the air like smoke. No one answered. The first letters began to take shape, written in careful Japanese script. They were filled with polite phrases, formal as "We are alive, we are being treated fairly, do not worry." But beneath those words lay unspoken truths. Nights spent laughing beside campfires, the taste of real coffee, the strange safety that came from a man's quiet respect. Some tried to disguise these truths as riddles or coded phrases. The grass here is tall, one woman wrote, meaning they let us breathe. Another wrote, the men do not shout, meaning they do not beat us. IEO simply